Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just about 30 seconds. Just want to get a chance for people to sit down and get comfortable. Thank you for joining. All right. Well, welcome everyone who is here in person and also every one of you who are joining us via Zoom. How extraordinary that we have two ways to have people join us today. Tonight is the first night of our Raising Healthy Families educational series this year. My name is Akila Reynolds, and I'm the Assistant Clinical Director and Pre- and Postdoctoral Director of Community Institute for Psychotherapy in San Rafael. Right here, we have lovely Amanda. She is our Assistant Clinical Director. She's also going to be helping monitor the Zoom. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box and Amanda will manage that for you. We're so glad to be able to offer this series that provides an opportunity to learn and to think together about some important topics that are affecting families all around in our community. Learning about mental health and wellness is an important issue for all of us to help decrease the stigma and also to help us raise healthy families. I'll tell you a little bit about CIP and then we'll stop and I'll let our speaker come in. Community Institute for Psychotherapy is a nonprofit, tax-exempt center founded in 1977. We provide quality, affordable mental health care services to Marin individuals and families so that they can reestablish mental and emotional well-being and also live satisfying and productive lives. We offer short-term and long-term outpatient psychotherapy services on a sliding scale. This allows adults, children, families, couples who otherwise would not be able to afford our services to be able to have healthy and affordable mental health care. Right now, we want to thank and acknowledge Mary Jane Burke and John Carroll and the Marin County Office of Education for co-sponsoring this event and making it possible to be here in person. We also want to say that we would not be here without our sponsors, businesses in Marin who take care of us and the community. So please note them, and when you have an occasion, please seek them out and do business with them. They're helping Marin be healthier. First, I want to start with First Federal Savings and Loan, Family Recovery Institute, Bank of Marin, Delfino Green and Green, Luther Burbank, and WMB2. Also, I wanted to say we have a survey at the end. So this is my first plug. Please fill out this survey so that we can have valuable information and continue to be able to provide these resources to the community. So now, I'm so excited to be able to introduce our first speaker. We want to thank you so very much for taking the time to meet with us today. This is Mark Edwards. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist, a psychotherapist, trainer, teacher, and consultant. Mark Edwards has maintained a private practice in San Rafael since 2000, where he has a variety of child, adolescents, and adult clients. He has worked in a variety of community organizations, and also for the last 10 years, he has experience teaching and supervising at the graduate level in the Department of Counseling at Sonoma State University. And additionally, I'd like to say that Mark spent 3 years in my position as Assistant Clinical Director at CIP, where he continues to both teach licensed and pre-licensed staff and supervise the work of our clinicians and interns. Thank you, Mark, for having us today. And I want to just allow you to come on, and I'm going to be quiet and let you all hear who you came to see.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks very much. It is a pleasure to be back here again this year. I'm not sure, I think this is year number 5. And I'm very pleased to have been invited to speak for, I think, all of those 5 years. Thank you for the invite once again. And I want to talk about something that it's a difficult topic to talk about. It's a difficult topic to teach. So first of all, I just want to let everybody know in the room and also on Zoom that the PowerPoint slides that you'll see behind me will be available to everyone who's attending today. They'll be emailed out to you. So if you have any problems seeing or reading anything up on the screen, recognize that you will receive a copy of this through email, and it'll be in a PDF format. What I've tried to do as much as possible, I have a long history of putting way too much information into presentations. So I've tried as much as possible to minimize what I'm presenting this evening to allow for as many questions as possible. So I hope that I'll have some time towards the end of the presentation for questions, either through Zoom, which will be kind of read to me, and also in the room. So if you have any questions, please hold them until the end of the presentation. I will be very, very happy to answer them. So before I get started this evening, I mentioned earlier that this is a very difficult topic to discuss. We're talking about having difficult conversations with our children. And so it's probably very important to start off with a few rules for this evening. The first is to take care of yourself, because what I'm going to talk about will be a little bit challenging. I'm certainly not going to present this in any way that is overstimulating. We're not going to be looking at pornography. I'm not going to be talking explicitly about pornography, but for some people, this subject, this topic carries a lot of weight. So if you find that this is too much, if you find that you are reacting emotionally to some of the things that I'm talking about, please take care of yourself. Take time away from the screen for those of you in Zoom. Take a break and go to the bathroom or walk the corridor if you feel that you need to. So please take care of yourself. Second, I'm talking about something that has a lot of moral implications for a lot of people. And I'm going to try very, very hard to stay away from issues of morality in pornography. It's very easy to make judgments about people's use. It's easy to make judgments about things like kink or extreme forms of pornography. I'm not going to take a moral position. I leave that entirely to you, but I recognize that you may have some strong reactions to some of the things that I'm talking about. We can spend time talking about that. It won't be a part of the presentation this evening. Third, it's important to recognize that pornography is not new. The speed at which it's delivered, the way in which it's delivered right now is very new, and it is ubiquitous. But pornography is always at the forefront of all communications technology. Those of us who can remember the VHS Betamax debates for home video in probably the 1970s, will recognize that eventually VHS won out, and it was actually the inferior technology. The reason that it won out is it was cheaper and it was adopted by the pornography industry. And that's why for that period of time we were using VHS over Betamax. If we go back a little further to the advent of the printing press, we can also see evidence of sexually explicit material that was being printed. If we think about cable TV, we think about references to the channel Skinamax, which of course is Cinemax, but pornography and sex is always at the forefront of communication, and it is at the forefront of internet communication too. The last thing that I want to say on this slide particularly, and this is a debate that I've had with myself. I've been teaching about pornography for the last few years. I've been talking and researching it for a lot longer, and I've really resisted coming out and speaking about this because one of the things that happens in my profession is that you become known as that guy. If you're the guy who works with teens, you're the teen guy. If you're the kid who if you're the person who works with children of divorce, you're the divorce guy. I do want to put on the ground, I am very happy to talk about pornography and it comes into my office all the time. I really don't want to be the porn guy. I recognize that that's almost inevitable. In fact, a friend of mine recently sent me an email where someone was looking for an expert in pornography and they were referred to me, and she sent me a copy of that listserv entry with the heading over the top, "Look at this, you're the porn guy." So there we go. So please consider me to be a little bit broader than simply talking about pornography. What we're going to talk about this evening, we're going to talk about a number of psychological processes that are involved in children and teens, particularly being drawn to pornography. This is not exclusive to children and teens. We're going to talk about problematic pornography use in children. We're going to talk about the potential for negative physical and psychological effects from use of pornography. And I'm going to spend the last part of the presentation outlining strategies for having that difficult conversation with your child or your children. And I'm hoping that I'm going to make a very strong case for having that conversation, whether you feel ready for it or not. So that's what we will talk about. There are also some things that we're not going to talk about this evening, which I think are important to outline, although we don't really have time for this in the conversation. The first, I'm not going to be talking specifically about misogyny in pornography. Porn, by definition, is a very misogynistic medium. It is very male-centered. It's largely focused around the male gaze, although it's also true that there is pornography produced specifically for women and by women. But in general, it's a pretty misogynistic kind of media. We could spend a whole evening talking about that. We're not going to. The second thing, we're not going to talk about race in pornography. Pornography in the United States also is a particularly racist medium. And by that, what I mean is, I was talking earlier on about the idea of pornography being made largely for the male gaze. I would suggest that it's being made largely for the white male gaze. And if people of ethnic minorities are involved in pornography, there's generally some kind of stereotype reason for them to be there. We could spend all evening talking about racism and race in pornography. We don't have time for that. I'm not going to be talking about the wider implications of pornography and the way that porn is influencing all aspects of American culture. When you begin to pay attention to things in the way that I do, you see evidence of it all the time, from grooming habits to fashion to screenwriting. It is everywhere, and it is fundamentally changing the way that we think about and talk about sex in the United States. Again, probably a whole dissertation worth of information. We're going to ignore that this evening too. And finally, one of the things that we won't be able to talk about this evening is LGBTQ issues in pornography. We're not going to talk about it not because we don't have time, but because there's very little research in this area. It is a growing area for researchers. There's very little information that's very clear-cut in this area. And what does exist around pornography for the LGBTQ population is largely connected to body image. So we're not going to be spending time talking about that either. But again, we could spend all evening talking about issues around identity in the LGBTQ community. We just don't have a lot of research. So that's all the stuff we're not going to talk about. So let's start in a very broad way, talking about and thinking about kids and teens looking at pornography. What I want to draw your attention to is this survey. This is perhaps the newest survey in this area. It was pulled together by Common Sense Media. Common Sense Media, if you don't know it, is a tremendous resource for parents. And it really is a place that you can go when you don't know about specific types of media. If your child is interested in watching a TV show or a movie or some other form of media and you don't know about it, Common Sense Media is a wonderful place to go where you can get the inside scoop, not only from professionals, but also from other parents. So you have an idea of what your children will see before they see it. So as a part of the research, they commissioned at the end of last year a survey of children and teens specifically around pornography. Now, there are lots of surveys and reports in this area, but I wanted to draw attention to this one because it literally is the most current research that we have. So the study took place at the end of 2022, and it was pulled together by BSG and had a sample size of about 1,500 kids between the ages of 13 and 17. This is a nationally representative sample, so it's a mixture of various different income levels, different racial groups, different sexual identities, and a number of trans kids were involved in this too. So it's a good size sample. It's a very strongly representative sample. And it took place in September. So in this survey, which ran from the beginning to the middle of September, there are a number of outcomes. The first is that of that 1,500, roughly 1,500 kids, about 75% of those children between 13 and 17 had viewed pornography at some point. The interesting thing about this number specifically is a similar survey of parents found that parents believed, about 50, 55, almost 60% of parents believed that their children had not actually seen porn. This survey points to the idea that roughly 3/4 of children between those ages actually have. When we break that down even further, and we take a look at the way in which sexual identity and sex plays into the use of porn or the viewing of porn, what we see is that cis boys, the number who have ever seen porn, is around 75%, cis girls, 70%. And for those who watch porn on purpose, so not kids who've been exposed to pornography or seen it accidentally or perhaps at a sleepover, for example, the number is slightly lower. Cis boys, around 52%, and cis girls, 36%. And it's important to point out for those people who don't understand or don't recognize the term cis boy or cis girl, cis male, cis female. Cis refers to a person whose gender identity aligns with those typically associated with the sex assigned to them at birth. So it's a piece of language that you will hear increasingly over time. So this is how the numbers break down in terms of boys and girls. We tend to see, and this is something that you'll see over and over again, boys drawn slightly more than girls, which some of us would perhaps expect. But the numbers are fairly close. When we look at the percentage of kids who viewed porn broken down by age, these are the numbers that we then see. So for kids under the age of 10, the number is around 15% of all respondents. So 15% of children 10 or younger have witnessed, viewed, or searched porn. If we go a little older, and we take a look at children from 13 years or 13 years and under, the number jumps to 54%. And if we go even older, and we look at kids below the age of 17, the number moves up to that 73% that I was talking about earlier on. When we look at the average age that kids are exposed to porn, the average age is 12 years. Now, this is actually a little later than other pieces of research that I've read. The general rule of thumb for me when I'm advising parents or talking with parents about when to have the conversation around pornography, I generally suggest by the time your child is halfway through 3rd grade, which is a lot younger than most parents are prepared to hear. But it is absolutely the case. Kids are exposed to pornography much earlier than we would at first imagine. When we think about first exposure, the numbers break down this way. 15% of those kids talk about their first exposure as being completely accidental. They came across something accidentally, it was exposed to them by somebody else, it wasn't necessarily something that they were searching for. When we see the other end of this graph right here, 29%, almost 30% of kids who look at pornography are looking at it because they were searching specifically for it. And then the group in the middle, which is around about another 30%, they have kind of, using kid logic, have suggested that it was partly accidental and partly on purpose. So make of that what you will. But it is interesting to me that about 30% of kids who are finding pornography, who are exposed to pornography, have found it purposely. They've been looking specifically for it. This will come back a little bit later on when we're talking about how to talk with your child about pornography. Of those kids in that 30% who watched intentionally, or report watching intentionally. This is how the numbers break down for that group. 59% of those kids who watch pornography intentionally watch at least once a week. Of the other group, about 31% report that they watch pornography, but they don't necessarily watch it every single week. And within that once a week or more group, that usage could be significantly higher than simply watching once a week. It could be as much as watching once, twice, or 3 times a day. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on too. So in terms of the sources, the places that kids find pornography, this is how those numbers break down. The vast majority, for those of you who can't see on Zoom, the vast majority of kids are watching pornography specifically on porn-related websites. Others find it in some way through social media or video sites. And then there's a surprisingly large number of kids who are watching pornography through subscription sites like OnlyFans, which we'll probably talk about later, or they're watching pornography through live streaming. That's kind of surprising to me because it involves a financial transaction. So these are kids with financial means who are using money to subscribe to those websites. So it's quite interesting and perhaps a little bit scary. Again, this is broken down by age and broken down by cis male and cis female at the end of the table. So in terms of discussing the issue of pornography, what's always interesting to me is where kids are discussing this. They're certainly discussing it with peers, but I have in the back of my mind that question, and it's really the question that formed this presentation. Are children able to talk to responsible adults about pornography, about their pornography use, about questions or concerns that they might have? And this survey points to this number, that 43% of those kids say they do have a trusted adult that they can talk to about pornography and issues raised by pornography. The other section, of course, is that 57% of those kids who are viewing pornography have not spoken to a trusted adult, to a parent, an aunt, an uncle, a therapist, a teacher. They are absolutely on their own, attempting to make sense of what they're seeing on the screen. And that's a little bit scary. It can feel very, very overwhelming, particularly for very young children. That's really, again, the purpose in this presentation. So it raises a big question: what draws kids to porn? Excuse me while I take a sip. Now, the answer to that is fairly obvious. It's a little bit, I was talking about this, teaching a class this morning, and it came, a quotation came to my mind. It was a question that was asked of, I think it's John Dillinger, who was a gunman and a robber during the 1930s, and he was asked why he robbed banks. And his answer was, that's where they keep the money. In this case, why are kids drawn to pornography? Because that's where we keep all the boobs and the bums. That's where all of the bodies are. And children particularly, and certainly teens, are very, very interested in their own bodies and the bodies of other people. So the answer is pretty obvious. But I'd suggest that there are more sophisticated and perhaps more complicated reasons that people, particularly kids, are drawn to looking at pornography. And I want to walk through a few of those right now. So the first is that kids search for porn because it feels like they're breaking the rules. And some kids get a big kick out of breaking the rules. Second, a lot of kids watch pornography not necessarily understanding why or what for, but they watch it because they want to be disgusted. They want to have a strong reaction to icky stuff that they see on TV. This is just the next version of seeing people kiss in a movie. Some kids watch it just to feel disgusted. Other kids are watching porn because they want to freak out their friends. They want to appear more sophisticated. They want to worry their friends. They want to be able to talk about things in a very kind of a freaky way. Some kids watch pornography simply because they know that other kids watch pornography. Some kids watch horror movies for exactly the same reason. We all know that we have those TV shows or movies that kind of sail through the zeitgeist, and every kid feels as though they're the only person who's not watching it, and they feel compelled to do so. Some kids watch porn for exactly that reason. Some kids, particularly older kids, watch pornography for sexual pleasure, the same reasons that adults watch pornography. And some watch to learn about sex. And for me, this is a really important point, because in the United States, when we look across the entire country, 50% of states have a mandate to teach sex education in schools. 50%. And of that 50%, only 50% have a mandate to teach sex education that's based on scientific principles. So in essence, we have 75% of the child population of this country learning nothing scientific or factual about sex. And the place that they're going is pornography. We have outsourced education about sex. We'll talk much more about that later. It's also true that there are some underlying psychological principles that we need to think about when we're looking at why kids are particularly drawn to pornography. These principles don't just exist for children and teens, they also exist for adults, and I think it's worth kind of outlining them. The first was written in a paper in 1998, and it's referred to as the AAA engine, and it specifically relates to pornography and the use of pornography. The first A is availability. Porn is eminently available. It is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. My computer right now is connected to Wi-Fi, and if I wanted to show you images of porn, we could do it in less than 15 seconds. It would take no time. You can locate porn very quickly. You can watch it pretty much anywhere. It's available. The second A is affordability. Most of the pornography that is available online is free. Porn websites are funded either through advertising or through referring to other porn websites. But the vast majority of porn that's out there has no cost associated with it. The third A is anonymity. Most people, as they surf around on the internet, believe themselves to be completely anonymous. There's some truth to that. There's a lot of mistruth to the idea of being anonymous online. We may get to some of that later on, and certainly around some of the questions that will pop up. But these three A's, the AAA engine, are a big piece of the draw towards pornography. Other underlying psychological principles. We have a pretty insatiable need for more. We like more things, we like newer things, we like new stimulation, we like things constantly to be replaced, to be bigger, to be faster, and so on and so forth. We have a neurobiological need for more of the things that we already have, and we're also drawn to more new things. In research, psychological research, this is research done in the late 1970s and early 80s, there's a concept that's referred to as supernormal stimulus. And supernormal stimulus is seen, you can witness this a lot in animals, you can also see it in humans, but it's boiled down to its basic principles. We tend to respond to larger versions of the stimulus that we would normally respond to. So the history of this research comes from a Nobel Prize winning researcher called Nico Tinbergen. And he actually won the Nobel Prize for this research, where he realized that stickleback fish, during the mating season, male stickleback fish become very aggressive, and that they develop on their backs a red patch. And in researching this particular experience with stickleback fish, they try to determine what is it that the fish are responding to in other males who come with a red patch that makes them so aggressive. They literally will physically attack other fish. They recognized that it wasn't endocrine, it wasn't secretions in the water, it wasn't the smell, it wasn't the taste, it was the patch of red across that fish's back. And they began to realize over time that if they changed the shape, they made the red bigger, the fish became more aggressive. And the way that they did this is they carved fish out of wood, a fish shape, and then painted a red splash on the back. What they began to realize was that the size and the shape of the fish was irrelevant. In fact, if you search on Google for this particular piece of research, you'll find that what they eventually came to was a diamond shape, block of wood in a diamond shape with a red patch, and that the fish would also become aggressive in response to that. This has also been found in birds, it's been found in butterflies, and one of the things that we know about supernormal stimulus is once animals and also human beings are exposed to a more exaggerated form of the stimulus that originally existed, more often than not, it's difficult to go back to the original stimulus. So once that fish had been agitated by a large patch of red, a small patch of red was a lot less threatening, and they didn't consider it to be something to attack. We see similar kinds of experiences in human experience, for example. If we think about film and television, if we think about books, what we're reading is not reality. It's an elaborated or an exaggerated form of reality. If we think about reality TV as a lovely example, there's nothing real about reality TV. It's always bigger, it's always exaggerated. But then scripted television isn't quite as interesting as it used to be. If you think about the, I don't know, crazy housewives of whichever city, or I present to you the Kardashians, who are as surreal as any family could possibly be, but they entertain millions and they're in the hearts and the minds of billions of people around the world. That exaggerated form of stimulus means that it's sometimes difficult to go back to what we used to be stimulated by before. Hold that thought for a second, because we also have a need for novelty. And the need for novelty is elaborated in something that's referred to as the Coolidge effect. I, as a child, grew up not on farms, but in a village between three farms, and all of the farmers raised cattle and sheep. They were very small farms by American standards, but nevertheless, they were working farms. And one of the things that I learned very young was that a farmer would have a herd of cows and one bull. The cows would be kept separated from the bull for most of the year, and in the spring, the bull would be introduced to the cows and would mate with all of those cows and produce cattle as offspring and produce milk. What also is something that farmers recognize really quickly is that after a period of time of mating with all of that group of cows, the bull will become less and less interested. And so if you want to increase your productivity, you have to find a way to increase the reproduction rate in the bull. So how do farmers do that? They don't replace the entire herd, they add one more cow. And that one cow is stimulating enough that the bull will then mate increasingly with that entire group. So a wise farmer will drip in one new cow every couple of weeks. It's referred to as the Coolidge effect, and I love this story. The Coolidge effect comes from the president, Calvin Coolidge, and his wife, who were at a state farm, an exhibition, a state exhibition of farming machines and technology and animals. And the president and Mrs. Coolidge found themselves in front of a large flock of chickens with a farmer who's talking about chickens and how he was having his chickens reproduce and how he was making vast sums of money. This was the 1930s. And lo and behold, in front of Mrs. Coolidge, the First Lady of the United States, a chicken is mounted by a rooster who begins to mate. And Mrs. Coolidge, to break the embarrassment, turns to the farmer and said, how often does he do that? And the farmer said, oh, about 20 or 30 times a day. And Mrs. Coolidge said, could you tell the president that? The president, hearing the conversation, turned to the farmer and said, well, how many chickens does he get to choose from? And the farmer said, about 100. To which the president said, could you tell Mrs. Coolidge that? That's why it's referred to as the Coolidge effect. It's also something that we see enacted in the use of pornography, that people very often will report that the newness of a new image, a new video, a subtle variation on their tendency to use a particular type or a particular style of pornography means that their interest in pornography generally is reinforced. It's also true, if we go back to the idea of supernormal stimulus, that when people begin to use pornography at length, when they tend to use pornography for long periods of time, the stimulation, the stimulus of being in a sexual relationship with another human being loses its interest because the experience of pornography is so present and so in your face and so exaggerated. So these are some underlying principles in the psychology of pornography. It's also worth paying a little bit of attention to a couple of neurological processes, or much more correctly, neurochemical processes, because we have not only the neurology of our brain, but we have the chemical process of our brain. And there are two systems that it's important to be aware of when we're thinking specifically about pornography use. The first is the dopamine system. The dopamine system, traditionally, we viewed as being connected to pleasure. That dopamine is the pleasure chemical. More recently, however, we're beginning to recognize that there's a little bit more subtlety than simply pleasure. Dopamine specifically is much more connected to the process of seeking, of searching, of looking and finding. And you'll find evidence of this in the construction of things like social media, YouTube. TikTok is particularly good at this. TikTok is not about the video that you're watching, it's about the next video that you're about to watch. It's always newness, it's always seeking the next thing. And for those of you who know TikTok or have used it, you'll recognize that this is the case. I'm sure if you have teens or children in your house, they definitely know. And one of the things about TikTok is it is so successful in utilizing seeking, searching, and reward that the originators of TikTok, ByteDance, actually put a warning into TikTok when you've been scrolling for 60 minutes. And after 60 minutes, there's a little message that comes up, and it's a person talking directly to you as the user saying, hey, you've been on TikTok for a long time. Why don't you take a break? Of course, you don't have to, but the relentlessness of the dopamine system is evident in that necessity. Similarly, alongside the dopamine system, we have the opioid system. The opioid system is connected to the process of liking. And these two systems synergistically are what's being hooked into by both social media, online video viewing, and particularly pornography. We also know that the dopamine system is heavily, heavily influenced by novelty. Again, it's not what I'm seeing right now, it's what I'm going to see next. It's the new thing, it's the next thing. And so we have these processes biochemically working all the time. If you prefer, we can use the words Mr. Spock from the 1960s TV show Star Trek, who said, you may find that having a thing is not so pleasant after all as wanting. It's not logical, but it's true. And we all have stories of wanting a bike. What was the BB gun in A Christmas Story? I don't remember the name of the gun, but wanting the bike, wanting the gun, wanting a new phone very often is more rewarding than actually having the thing in our hands. And that's definitely the case with both social media, other aspects of technology, and definitely pornography. Other underlying psychological processes, one thing that I like to point out all the time, this is a very, very early psychological process that was outlined in the very early days of behaviorism and of pre-Skinner behaviorism. And it's the idea of response cost, that everything that we're engaged in has a cost associated with it. It can be a psychological cost, it could be a physical cost. And an example that I like to give is the cost of going to your doctor or your dentist and being presented with the option to get up to the second floor where your doctor's office is. You have a choice of either the elevator or the stairs. All things being equal, half of those people would take the stairs, half would take the elevator. But if you move that doctor or dentist to the 15th floor, you increase the cost of moving up to that level. You also change the degree to which people are likely to take the elevator or to walk. We tend to use things that are cheaper, not just physically, but also emotionally and cognitively. There's evidence of this when you go to the grocery store. Next time you're there and you see, a good example is the wine aisle. The most expensive wine is at eye level and the cheaper wine is down below. Similar with any mass product like breakfast cereals. The more expensive breakfast cereals are easy to see. The less expensive breakfast cereals are further down. And our behavior is constantly being shaped by the response cost of our responses. We tend to do the easier thing, all things being equal. But when we're thinking about the psychology of pornography, response cost plays a slightly different role. We can suggest that the experience of being in reality, in real sexual relationships, is very expensive. Think about how difficult it is to maintain a relationship. Think about how difficult it is to negotiate sex in a relationship. On the other hand, think about the low response cost of fantasy, the low response cost of pornography. If I'm looking for sexual gratification, it's much cheaper to open a laptop and spend 10 minutes. And so what we tend to see is that sexual relationships with real people are very expensive, very complicated, very emotionally taxing. And relationships with pornography online are very inexpensive. So given the choice, particularly for young people, for children and teens who may struggle socially or may be learning about themselves and learning about sex, we can understand almost immediately why pornography is the choice for many kids and teens. The response cost is simply lower. Is it as rewarding? I'll leave that to you or to those kids and teens to determine. So it's important at this point, excuse me for a second. It's important at this point to talk about the potential pitfalls, the potential dangers of watching pornography. Again, I'm going to stay pretty far away from the kind of moral implications and the moral questions around pornography. I want to talk about things that are much more specific. So the first thing that I would suggest, based on what we've been talking about so far, both supernormal stimulus and the Coolidge effect, would suggest that people who do find themselves using pornography will find themselves constantly looking for newer or slightly altered versions of the pornography that they're currently engaged in. What we also tend to see is that novelty in pornography is a more exaggerated form of the sexual escapades that we were perhaps originally drawn to. This is referred to in the industry as gonzo porn. This comes from gonzo journalism, which some of you may remember from the 1970s, kind of freewheeling, very aggressive, devil-may-care kind of journalism. In pornography, what it tends to show up as is more violent, more extreme, more misogynistic, more exaggerated forms of sexuality. Again, if we go back to that idea of supernormal stimulus, What we tend to see is once people move to that more aggressive, more gonzo forms of pornography, they tend not to move back again because the original stimulus is less attractive and less of a draw. What this results in is what many people refer to as pornography drift or porn drift, being drawn to one set of images and then moving to things that feel more threatening. It's referred to very often as, in the words of clients who are talking about this in psychotherapy, their experience is that they're looking at pornography that's much more deviant than they were originally drawn to. And so it's not necessarily the use of porn that's troubling, it's the kind of porn that I'm now looking at that is something that really worries me. And that's a very, very common experience, certainly in my work, working with particularly young men around issues of pornography. Online pornography also emphasizes action over reality. When we look at porn, there are very, very seldom examples of things like safety. It's very unusual to see discussions of condoms or birth control, and if they are, there's probably a plot point on some level, but that gets in the way of the action. So it tends to be irrelevant. Again, for kids, particularly for teens who are looking to pornography to learn about sex and sexuality, this is a problem, as is the idea that consent is never negotiated in porn. This is problematic for young men, again, who are taught, perhaps even conditioned by pornography, that sex happens automatically and that there's very little need for negotiation around what that couple or what those people are going to be engaged in. An example of this, oh, excuse me, I'm leaping ahead in my mind. One of the things that I think is really important, and again, in talking with children about the reality of porn, and particularly in talking with teens about the reality of porn, I think it's important to recognize that porn, by definition, hijacks people's sex lives. So what do I mean by that? This phrase is a phrase that I've used a lot with teens, particularly, and adults that I work with. Rather than your sexuality or exploring your sexuality starting in adolescence and starting with A and moving through your life as your interests and your experiences develop and your passions develop over time, we don't move from A to Z over a lifetime. Children or teens viewing pornography move from A to BDSM very, very quickly. Again, sexuality is spread across a vast continuum. It's not my place to talk about what's right or what's wrong, what's healthy or what's not. But one of the things that we know is that pornography, in effect, as sexual education, is sex education through a fire hose. You see everything all at once. So very young kids are being exposed to very, very hardcore pornography very, very quickly and are ill-equipped, first of all, to understand, and then to take those experiences into the real world. So when we talk about the real world, again, I'm leaping ahead a second. One of the things that we also recognize is that being involved in pornography or witnessing pornography means that many children, many teens particularly, will then struggle with negotiating that sexual interest in other people. Pornography is easy, it's freely available, the cost, the response cost is much lower than negotiating with a real person. And so, in effect, the use of pornography becomes the cause of sexual problems and also becomes the answer to the same problem. Now, as evidence of this, I point out something that I was very aware of very early in my clinical career. When I was in grad school, I had a professor who taught a sex therapy class. And in the first couple of weeks, she'd been to a presentation. She's a sex therapist in the East Bay. I believe she's still practicing. She'd been to a presentation by Pfizer. And she came into our class and she said, if you have any money anywhere, you need to invest it in Pfizer right now, because they've just invented something that changes the future of sex. And the thing that they had invented was Viagra. Now, at the time, I was in grad school, nobody had any money, so I'm not speaking to you from my personal yacht. So I didn't get to invest in it. But at the time that Viagra was invented, when it was marketed to men in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. That was the target market. These are men who, for largely biological, some psychological, but largely biological reasons, have problems either gaining or maintaining erections. What we now know is, certainly over the course of the last 10 years, that there is a secondary market. And it's a secondary market that did not exist when Viagra was invented. And that secondary market is men from 19 to 25. These are young men who, largely because of their use of pornography, are finding it difficult to be involved in sexual relationships with other people and are resorting to chemicals to increase their ability to gain and maintain erections. This is one of the ways in which pornography is changing sex between human beings, between people. The other thing that I think is really important to point out, we were talking earlier on about the idea of porn being a place for kids and teens to learn about sex. We're also very aware that this is beginning to change the sexual repertoire, the sexual behavior of people in real time. So how do we know this? I'll give you a lovely example. This is a headline that I found in the Guardian newspaper. This was Wednesday, the 2nd of December of last year. And this is a piece, I've actually read other papers about this, research papers about this phenomenon. This is a piece that was written by a young woman who was talking about the idea of choking in sexual relationships between men and women, and how normalized it's becoming as a result of pornography. The headline on this story is, "Sexual choking is now so common that many young people don't even think it requires consent." That's a problem. Inside this story, there is a quote that I wanted to put onto this slide too. This is from this author's actual experience. And what she says is this: "Once I was kissing someone, quite casually I might add, and he put his hand around my neck and started to choke me. I moved his hand away from me and I said, 'Why are you doing that?' And he said, 'I don't know, I thought you'd like it.' When I told him I didn't, he seemed genuinely surprised." So in research, what this looks like is this: the 2020 National Probability Study, revealed that 21% of women had reported being choked while involved in sexual activity. And 21% of women and 20% of men said that they had choked a woman during sex. In that particular study, respondents between the age of 18 and 29 reported choking at a much higher rate than people who were older. And so we're beginning to recognize that choking, after witnessing violent imagery and pornography, is now mainstreaming into sexual behavior between adults. But a second study, this was in 2022, this was a study specifically around college students. And in the female college population, 58% of college females, college age girls, reported being choked during sex. Now, 20 years ago, outside of the BDSM community, choking in sex was largely completely unknown. It's now very much a part of sexual relationships between adults. It is a new thing. It's something that has been introduced and normalized, mainstreamed by pornography. That's a little bit of a concern for me. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about pornography with kids. I would suggest that there are a few things that we try to hold in mind in initiating this kind of a conversation. And I would hope that the presentation so far has perhaps pointed out that this is a conversation that we need to start having. Children, by definition, are not being taught about sex. They're certainly not being taught about pornography. And I think it behooves us as professionals and as parents that we have these kinds of conversations. I'd actually go one step further for those people who might be educators. I have a very, very strong belief that pornography should be a part of the education curriculum for children, that we should be talking specifically about pornography and managing pornography in schools. We certainly need to be doing a much better job of talking about sex in schools, because whether we talk about it or not, it is occurring. And I think broader than that, perhaps in schools, we should be thinking much more about teaching kids and teens to be citizens of the 21st century and digitally informed citizens. Because again, many people and many adults, many parents are not particularly keen on utilizing technology, and many kids are finding their way through this essentially on their own. So what are the things that I would suggest in terms of having this kind of conversation? These are the first few points. The first thing that I would suggest is that you literally utilize this piece of language. You're not in trouble. Many kids' experience of porn, many kids' experience of sex in general, is connected to feelings of shame. And it's important for us to recognize and to point out to kids that it is a very natural experience to want to be interested in sex, to want to find out about sex and about other people and other people's bodies and how they work. So this should be the first point. This should be the first thing that we talk about. This is a natural experience that you're engaged in, and you are not in trouble. The second thing that I would suggest, you really have to understand who your child is. You need to understand how they are stimulated or overstimulated in conversation, how they'll communicate to you that they've heard enough and they need to go somewhere else and be someplace else. You also, frankly, need to realize that the conversation that you'll have with an 11-year-old is very different than the conversation that you'll have with a 17-year-old. So it's important when you go into this conversation that you're pitching it to the age, the level of sophistication, and the level of understanding of the child that you're talking to. I'd suggest you build the discussion for the developmental level of your child, the sophistication of your child. Third, this is a hard thing to do, but your objective is to stay as calm as you possibly can. And what do I mean by that? Pace yourself. Think about the things that you want to say and the things that you don't want to say. And be sure to set the time and place so that you feel comfortable and confident to have this kind of conversation. And also, perhaps the most important thing, remember to breathe. I can't tell you how many people get out of breath when they have these kinds of conversations. One of the things that we know about our mind-body connection is that breathing is the path to salvation. Breathing is the path to being calm. The next point that I'd suggest is that you ask questions. Ask what your child has experienced. Ask what they have seen. Ask where they've seen it. Ask if they have questions about the things that they have seen or need to have things explained or filled out in some way. And most importantly, listen to the answers. Your child is the expert on their experience. Listen much more than you talk. The next point that I'd suggest layer the discussion. Think about this, any kind of discussion like this, as an opening gambit. This is not something that you're going to talk about for 2 hours and then it's all over. This is the beginning of a long-standing conversation. It's a conversation, or perhaps several conversations. It's not a lecture. You're not teaching your child, you're listening and conversing with your child. I'd also suggest that as much as you can, you back up the conversation with science, with facts. You have some material that you can hand to your child, perhaps that you've printed out earlier, and I'll be giving some resources in just a second that you'll be able to give to your kids, because they will be as overstimulated and as terrified in the process as you will be, and they will need to take things elsewhere and be able to read about those things. So be prepared, have literature, be able to pass it to your child. I'd also, again, go back to what we were talking about just a second ago. Allow and encourage your child to speak as much as is possible. What we're talking about is their experience rather than yours. We're talking about them making sense of the experience rather than you teaching or telling how to make sense of the experience. I would try as much as possible to let them know that you're interested in the thoughts that they have about what they've seen and how they understand it. As a general rule in these kinds of conversations, I usually suggest as much as is humanly possible, and I think this is much more an issue for parents of older teens, try as much as possible not to use the term addiction, because it alienates a lot of kids. Kids know what addiction is, and for some kids, particularly teens, to think about particular behaviors or experiences online as being addictive is kind of off-putting. It's kind of minimizing. So I'd suggest alternate language. Your struggle with pornography, your problem with pornography, our problem with pornography. That pornography is a challenge rather than an addiction. So use of words matter in this circumstance. I'd also, as much as possible, try to remember that this is not an event, it's a process. It's a process that will go on through high school, through middle school, through high school, through college, through adulthood. Pornography isn't something that will be solved or changed. It's not going to go away. It will be there right the way through your child's life, and it will become more and more a part of our culture, of our society. It is in the same way that we learn to tie laces and that builds our competence for other things that we then try to do. What we're trying to teach is a set of skills, judgments and skills, assessment skills for moving forward in some form of a relationship with pornography. So this is not something that will be solved by one conversation. It's something that you'll be returning to and that your child will be returning to for much of their life. This is not going away anytime soon. I'd also point this out, and this is, I think, quite an important point, that pornography isn't just a problem for kids and teens. It's a problem for adults too. And kids who have pornography issues or questions around pornography become adults who have similar kinds of relationships with the same media. I particularly like this phrase, and I like this phrase in response to all issues of questions around technology, gaming, social media use, responding to texts all the time, that it is a very, very appropriate thing to monitor young children's use of technology. If we're talking about middle schoolers, absolutely you should be monitoring everything that they see. You should be using software blocking. You should be looking at the places that they go, and so on and so forth. But our objective as parents, as adults, is to move fairly quickly, or as quickly as we can, from monitoring to mentoring. I work a lot with young men, particularly with issues around technology. And one of the things that I've found repeatedly is kids who have had their media consumption controlled or their gaming controlled until the point at which they leave their home. And many of those kids are smart enough and fortunate enough to go off to college and get halfway through that first semester and realize that they're failing all of their classes because they never learned how to turn off the Xbox. So developing the skills to be able to do that when it's appropriate much later is a really important part of raising kids in an age of technology. We need to move from monitoring to mentoring. How do we live with this experience? Because frankly, unless we're going to be Amish, our kids are going to be dealing with issues of compulsive technology use, compulsive gaming, and compulsive pornography use for the rest of their lives. The skills that they gain as teens and children are transferable into much later life. Not unlike learning when it's time to go to bed early. It is a very specific developmental skill. I've had any number of kids who say, now I feel like a grown-up because I can say, tonight I need to go to bed early. I can't stay up late every night. So the other thing that I wanted to provide this evening, and this again will be on the PowerPoint slides, so you'll be able to find access to these websites, are some additional resources outside of this conversation that I think are going to be useful. And so these are a few of the resources that I point you in the direction of. The first is Common Sense Media. We talked about this earlier on. Common Sense Media is the originator of that survey that I talked about at the top of the class. Fight the New Drug is a really very, very useful website, particularly for teens with issues or questions about pornography. Fight the New Drug is very, very well funded. It's one of those things that I think you join as a kind of a member. It's completely free to be associated with Fight the New Drug, but they make available very, very easily a couple of films that are made by teens, for teens, about teens and pornography, about the effects of pornography, both interpersonally, sexually, and in some cases spiritually. So these are really, really good kind of documentaries, films made for teens by teens that are a very, very good place to start. If you're not perhaps ready to have that conversation, but you're trying to introduce the idea that you're going to have the conversation. So Fight the New Drug is a terrific resource. The Reward Foundation is based in the UK, has a similar kind of outlook to many of these resources, giving facts, data, information, and for those of you who are interested in reading original research, there's a tremendous amount of original research in the Reward Foundation, as is Your Brain on Porn. Your Brain on Porn is both a website and also a publication book, and it can be very, very useful for older teens. Some of the earlier Fight the New Drug and Common Sense Media do a really lovely job of addressing kids at various different age ranges and cater the message to younger kids as well as older kids. And down at the bottom, for those of you who are interested in TED Talks, and a lot of people are, I've given a link specifically to a TED Talk by a woman called Emily Rothman, who's a researcher in teenage sexuality and particularly in pornography. It's a tremendous little video. I think it's about 15 minutes long. And she talks about working specifically with kids in this area and talking with kids about sexuality and particularly about pornography. So those are a few resources. These are the references, the papers, the research that I use to compile this presentation. And again, what I've tried to do as much as possible is to leave lots of time and lots of space for any questions, because I suspect that there may be individual questions that people have around their own situation or their own child. So I'm very happy to entertain those thoughts and those questions. And with that in mind, I would like to open up the presentation to anybody who may have questions. For those of you who are on Zoom, feel free to drop those into the chat, and those will be read out to me right here. And I'll be able to spend some time talking with you and also with people in the room. So any thoughts or questions that anybody might have? Again, I recognize it's a difficult topic, but I'm also very willing to spend some time talking about specific questions. Go ahead.
What do you say to parents who haven't even had conversations with their children about sex or about their bodies?
Mm-hmm.
How do they manage this conversation?
The first thing is start with those conversations about sex and about bodies. Those conversations should probably start earlier than any of us feels comfortable to start them, but it's a very, very valuable place to start. Again, what we're attempting to do, even with very, very young children, we're not necessarily teaching them facts and figures and how-tos, but we're beginning to initiate a conversation. We're beginning to talk about the fact that we can talk about these things. So talking about sex, talking about relationships, talking about how people are drawn together, that's the beginning part. And this is really the kind of conversations that we'd be having during the elementary years. What is important to recognize, certainly in California and in San Rafael where we are, it's very, very well known both to parents and also to children that second semester of fifth grade, usually around about this time of the year, February, March, is the time to have that conversation at school. That is the perfect time to follow up on the information that they're learning at school, again, without being overwhelming, but also introduce the idea that even for fifth graders, sixth graders, and so on, you may see things, you may witness things online or be shown films that are confusing or embarrassing or kind of nasty. And to be able to have conversations about those things that may have made you feel uncomfortable. And that's the language with very young children that I would suggest. Things that you may have seen, things that other people may have shown you, things that you may have found that made you feel uncomfortable. You don't even need to use the word sex, although we all know that that's what we're talking about. So that, with very young children, is the way that I would introduce this conversation. Thank you for the question. Go ahead.
So the one piece that I shared with my kids when they were, well, in high school, which was later than this, but times were different then, was that, and we did talk about porn, and I think one of them had seen some porn. And what I said was that sex in real life is very, very different than movies or in porn.
Yeah.
And that my hope is that they would stay away from that so that they could find their own way. It's really special to have those experiences in real life. Absolutely. Without having an image of what it's supposed to look like.
Absolutely.
And that resonated.
Yeah.
But that's all I kind of knew to say. Do you have other things that parents can say? I mean, some of this material, or you don't want to be like too convincing, because that pushes kids away too.
Sure, sure.
Even though I want to give a whole long list of all the but what else do you suggest that parents say?
Well,
after listening.
Sure, absolutely. I would say exactly that. And that for me, I think, is the key to having these conversations, particularly about the potential dangers, the pitfalls of looking at pornography. That what you're seeing is a stylized, heightened, aggressive version of what sexual relationships really look like. Very often I use the example of the difference between watching a story that that happens at school every day. If someone was to wander around with a video camera at school, and then you were to go home and show that video, and it would be very interesting about the things that you got involved in, but it wouldn't be, very stimulating. It wouldn't be very huge. Now compare and contrast that with a Marvel movie. Superheroes are a lot of fun to watch, but you know that, I don't know, Thor picking up Loki and throwing him around, he'd do that once and that would kill that other person. The things that we see on screens are exaggerated versions. You're not going to do the things that Superman or Spider-Man do. You're not going to be as agile as a Jedi. That is something that's heightened, it's stylized, it's make-believe. And that porn is in essence a stylized, heightened, make-believe version of what sex is. And in just the same way that you're not going to get into a fist fight with somebody in the same way that a cowboy does, you're also probably not going to be engaged in the same things that you see in pornography in a real sexual relationship. And for me, that is absolutely the key. Again, the thing that I try to balance as much as possible, and I encourage parents to balance as much as possible, is that kids are naturally inclined to want to know about these things. The thing that we have to remind them is the things that you're naturally drawn to and inclined to view because you're a scientist, you want to know how things work. This is actually a really very, very exaggerated, very blown up, very Marvel version of the reality of sexual relationships between people. And frankly, in a lot of circumstances, if you find yourself doing these things in a sexual relationship, these are things that will get you into trouble. They will harm you, they will harm other people, they'll certainly harm other people's feelings. That's not a good way to be connected and to have relationships with other people. So I think you are absolutely dead on.
Can you repeat how you said that? I don't think so. Just try. I know.
Yeah, but and then Mark can maybe repeat it back because we are at because the audience is wanting that.
I mean, I told my girls that wasn't like real life.
Yeah.
And it showed images. My concern was they would think that they had to look that way or act that way or do those things. And that's not lovemaking in real life.
Yeah.
And I wanted them to have the experience of that first kiss and, their exploration in a relationship in their own time without images.
Yeah.
Because we do compare, we can't help but kind of compare ourselves.
Yeah.
So that part I said.
Yeah.
What I love about your presentation is it adds all these other levels, like the dangers of wanting them the newest, biggest next thing and the next thing, and
Yeah, it's very true. To repeat what was just talked about in the room here was this idea of being able to talk with kids about the idea that the sex that they will be seeing in pornography is not like the sex that they will be experiencing in real life. It's an exaggerated version of exactly the same thing. And to allow kids and to encourage kids to have their own experience of investigating and understanding their own sexuality and their own sexual relationships. Similarly, this actually came up in a presentation that I gave this morning on exactly the same topic. I talk with kids all the time, not specifically around issues of sexuality, but around issues of media. So the example that was given this morning was from somebody who was working with a very young child who had just watched the movie It, which for those of you who don't know is kind of a horror movie that involves children being eaten by a clown. Very horrific, very adult. It was all the rage, I'd say, about 9 months ago, perhaps a year ago. But this conversation, I think, in a lot of ways is very similar. The language that I use with kids around all forms of media are, first of all, what's the motivation in wanting to see it? Why do you want to see this thing? Generally, it's because everybody else is watching it. The follow-up to that, in effect, is, are you ready to see things that are going to make you feel uncomfortable? Are you ready to see things that you might think about after you've seen them? Are you ready to see things that you might have dreams or nightmares about? Because, and I think, again, this translates to all forms of media, including pornography and including all online life, once you see this thing, you can't unsee it. So the question in the back of my mind, and the question that I have for kids all the time is, do you want that inside your head? If you do, then You can choose to watch it, you can choose to engage in it, but recognize that there may be some after effects that you're not ready for. You may find yourself feeling afraid at night. You may find yourself having nightmares. You may find yourself thinking about these things long after you've seen them. If you're ready to do that, you can choose to do it, and we will spend time talking about the after effects. But if you're not ready to see those things and have them inside you permanently, then don't choose to do it right now. There is lots of time to see it. There's lots of time to see vampire movies. There's lots of time to see pornography if you so choose. But right now, do you want that inside your head? When we explore online, we have access to everything. And children, on some level, are beginning to recognize that, certainly as they move into adolescence. They can look for bomb-making instructions, they can look for pornography, they can look for ways to do their homework without actually doing it. They can look for beheading videos. The question is the same. Do you want to go down that road? Do you want to have that stuff inside your head? If you don't, if you're not ready for it, then we'll put that aside. There's always time to come back. Don't ever feel pressured into doing something that you don't feel ready for. An empowerment around that statement, you have to feel ready for it. That's the most important thing. And again, is translatable right across the media spectrum. Other thoughts? Do we have any questions from our Zoomies, as some teachers refer? I think all things are quiet. I don't have my glasses on,
They
which
came back.
sadly...
They were asking for restatements from some of the questions.
Restatements of the questions. Okay, good. Other thoughts, questions, or concerns that people might have in the room? Let me put this a different way. Has anyone had this kind of conversation with their own children that's been either successful or unsuccessful?
My kids are very young,
Mm-hmm.
so we have definitely had this conversation, but at 6 and 8, we've kind of limited it to, there's a chance that if you're out somewhere, someone's going to show you these pictures or show you a video on their cell phone or something like that, and you can choose to walk away from those because it's not going to feel good.
Right.
And we just don't show pictures of any parts of the body that are underneath bathing suits.
Yeah.
That's just not appropriate right now.
Yeah.
And so we've talked about it, and I think they get it because I'll ask them.
Yeah.
And they seem really comfortable. I think if I'm comfortable having the conversation, they're comfortable having the conversation.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. Actually, you've reminded me of one thing that I did want to put into this presentation. I'll add this into the list of resources before it's distributed. Very often in presentations like this, the conversation turns to issues of sexting. Kids who send, usually teens, who send perhaps nude or semi-nude pictures of themselves to boyfriends or girlfriends. And the reality that this is very much a part of teenage dating, or at least has been for quite some time. As a general rule of thumb, again, and I think most parents will take this perspective, the suggestion would be don't ever communicate nude photographs of yourself to someone else. Because even though you love them, and even though they would never break your heart and do anything naughty or nasty with them, those things happen every single day. And once they're out there, the message that we give all the time is they are out there forever. Now, the reason that I raised this evening, and I will put this resource in the resource section, there is a new technological move towards being able to purge the internet of previously released nudes that are out there in the world. If I'm remembering correctly, the website is called something like takeitdown.com. And in essence, there's been a lot of discussion about how to do this effectively. So the beauty of using digital images, which are the images that are created by photographs and distributed through the web, is that they have a fingerprint. And so as artificial intelligence increases, as we can start to utilize AI to identify images, we can now start to scan images and ask AI bots to go out there all over the internet and take them down and scrub them from the internet. What's happened with take it down or bring it down, I can't remember. Again, I'll pop this into the resources. There's now actually a way to do that without scanning the original photograph. It's by taking what's essentially a thumbprint of that image without the details of the actual image that can then be scoured from the internet. There are a number of technology companies that are involved in this: Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, and notably, one of the first, I think there are 5 or 6 companies that are involved in this. One of those companies is a company called Pornhub. They are now utilizing this technology to take down images that have been posted on the internet without the permission of the person that they were taken of. So we're beginning to see a little bit of a shift there. Again, it's very, very early days, and this initiative was literally announced 2 or 3 days ago. It is a brand new initiative. It'll be interesting to see how successful that is. So we may actually have reached a point in the development of technology where those unwanted, unintentional, unwilling images that have been put onto the internet may eventually be scrubbed from the web. So we'll see how things go, but that is a new direction in terms of being able to watch those things. Again, as a general rule of thumb, do not post nudes, do not give nudes to other people, unless you're doing it consensually, and unless, certainly for a lot of people, there's some kind of financial exchange. That's very often the case with websites like OnlyFans, for example, where people set themselves up with the ability to sell their own videos or their own photographs. It's also very important, particularly with children under the age of 18. I use this in many ways to put the fear of God into children around passing nude photographs or nude videos of themselves to other teens. If you are under the age of 18 and you take a photograph of yourself that is a sexual photograph and you email it or text it to yourself, technically you can be convicted of possessing and distributing child pornography. Now, that is entirely at the discretion of the district attorney in the location that you live. And I know that the district attorney of Marin County does not prosecute those cases because they happen all the time. But in other jurisdictions, this actually and absolutely does happen. There are a number of cases, particularly in some southern states, where children have been prosecuted for distributing child pornography when they've sent a nude photograph of themselves to their boyfriend. It is a technical violation of that law. And the penalties for possessing and particularly distributing child pornography are very, very severe, and they will follow you for a lifetime. So again, if you want to scare your children or your teens into not sending those photographs out, that's the language that I'd suggest that you use. Again, much more with older kids than with younger ones. Go ahead.
Do you have a suggestion of what parents could do if they feel that their teen is addicted to either porn or just the internet use?
The first thing that I'd suggest is that they're connected to some of the resources that I was talking about earlier. It's important for kids to recognize, again, that their interest is natural, but the obsessive use, the compulsive use of pornography is problematic. Very often the way that this manifests itself is through a series of questions. And one of the questions that I ask of teens who utilize pornography a lot is, have you found yourself thinking about sex or thinking about sexual images when you've been doing other things? Because one of the aspects of pervasive use of pornography is intrusive thoughts. This is particularly true for kids and teens who've seen a lot of pornography and then find themselves thinking about it as they're walking down the street, as they're talking with their teacher, as they're sitting over dinner with their family member. And for kids and teens, it can be very, very disturbing. So that for me is usually a lovely window into discussing why this is problematic and how problematic it is. Now, if you don't feel comfortable or competent in having that conversation, I would suggest, first of all, you visiting and viewing the videos on fightthenewdrug.com, and then showing your kids or your teens those videos, because they do a tremendous job talking with kids who identify themselves as being on some level addicted to pornography, and how they find themselves moving away from that, and how it's changed the nature of their relationships with their peers, with their parents, and with their friends. It is really quite empowering and quite a useful place to go. Again, these are very, very difficult conversations to have, but Fight the New Drug is a very, very good resource to encourage those conversations, or to encourage kids to think about those conversations if you're not ready to have it. Other questions or thoughts that we might have? I think in that case, we may have reached a natural close, if that feels useful. I have at the top of the presentation on that cover page, I believe I have my website if anybody wants to contact me with any questions or any specific issues that they may be having. Certainly, I would strongly recommend, if you have children or teens who are struggling in this area and you need additional support, that you contact the staff at the Community Institute for Psychotherapy for additional support and for resources. And certainly feel free to reach out to me. Also, keep your eyes open around other trainings in this area, and definitely take a look at those resources that I provided in the slide deck, again, which everyone who's attending today will receive a copy of, hopefully over the course of the next few days. Once again, a recognition and a reminder that there is an evaluation for this class. I understand that will be provided on Zoom for those people in a web link, and for people in the room, you'll be asked to do exactly the same thing, just to evaluate how the presentation went this evening. And with that, I'll hand things back over, and I'll step out of the frame. There you go.
Thank you so much, Mark. You did a wonderful job on talking to us about a very challenging topic for some, but I feel more equipped. And so I hope other people feel equipped too. And I want to thank everyone online and in person for joining us and learning about this very important topic. I will say, yes, please fill out the brief survey. We'll either email it to you if you're in person, if you're online. We might email it to you, but it's right in the chat box right now. So just fill it out briefly and share about your experience with Mark. I also want to just share a little bit about CIP and the services that we offer. So please feel free to reach out to us if you're interested in therapy. Amanda can put the number in the comment section, and I can also verbalize it to you. It's 415-459-5999, extension 102. Again, that is 415-459-5999, extension 102. We work with individuals of all ages, couples, and also families, and we have a sliding scale in addition to accepting Beacon Partnership Health and Medi-Cal. I just also want to remind you before we leave here that we have 3 more Raising Healthy Families series. So if you enjoyed Mark, come back, because there'll be more people who are really excellent. Next Wednesday, we'll be talking about some more challenging topics that I think many parents will benefit from. Wednesday, the 8th, from 6 to 8 p.m., we'll be talking to children and adolescents about talking to children and adolescents about suicide, self-harm, and other risk behaviors. I want to make a note that this one will only be via Zoom. So you will log in, and our presenter there will talk to you about those topics, and hopefully you'll feel more equipped to talk about that with your own children. The Wednesday after that, Wednesday, March 15th, from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. again, is the Boy Crisis: Why Our Sons Are Struggling and What We Can Do About It. That will be presented by Warren Farrell. And that will be in person and also Zoom. So it will be like this one today. And then our last one will be closing it out with Amanda. She's talking about acing parent-teen partnership, 5 skills for relationship science to optimize adolescent development. That will be on March 22nd from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. in person here in San Rafael and also via Zoom. I thank you very much for your time, and if you don't have any other questions, we'll see you next week.
Thank you.